Oh,
we want to study Amir Hashem Daf Mem Gimel, but we have to start on Mem Beis on Mem Beis.
Hi, how are you, Ira?
Oh, Ira, Charlie wants to say hello.
How you doing? Chag Kasher v'Sameach. I'm going to borrow your keys.
Okay.
I'm going to take me to the truck.
Oh, that's so nice. Wow.
First on, just give me 1 sec. We're on Mem. I got to get the Gemara. We're on Mem Beis.
Oh yeah, Mem Beis.
Okay, just give me 1 sec.
So we'll see this on Daf Mem Beis on Mem Beis, and it's, let's count up from the bottom of the Daf. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Rabbi Avo, Ministamich fi Azel Rabbi Avo. Rabbi Avo was walking and he was leaning akatfe on the shoulders of Rabbi Nachum Shamei, of his sidekick, I guess you'd call it. In Yiddish, we call it a Heisbacher, his second in command, Rabbi Nachum. And Rabbi Nachum was mankid vi Azel Hilchus Samine, and he would, so to speak, collect Piskei halachos, the final version or the final ruling of halachos as they were walking. Boy mine, so Rabbi Nachum asked Rabbi Avo, machlokas v'yachkach stam. What happens if Rebbe records a machlokas in a Mishnah and then he records one opinion anonymously without any name? Amalei halacha kistam. The reason why Rebbe added that Mishnah is to tell you that the halacha is like that opinion. Then he asks him, stam v'achach machlokas mai. What if the stam, the Mishnah without a name on it, appears first, and only in a later Mishnah does Rebbe record a machlokas? Amalei ein halacha kistam. This is the exception to the rule, and the reason why Rebbe put the stam first is to tell you that we don't paskin necessarily like this stam. We paskin perhaps like the other Mandi Omer in the later Mishnah. Then he asks him, stoma de masnisen, what happens if we have a Mishnah with a stam, no machlokas, umachlokas bebraisa? The Brisa records the machlokas. Amalei aloch kistam. We're not interested in the Brisa, we're interested in the Mishnah. Aloch kistam Mishnah, even if there's a Brisa that records the machlokas. Machlokas b'masnisen ustoma bebrisa. What happens if the Mishnah records the machlokas, and in the Brisa record anonymously one opinion? My Amalei. Here we turn to Daf Mem Gimel. V'chi Rebbe lo shna'a Rebbe Chia minayin lo. Now Rebbe is a teacher. Rabbi Chia is the next generation. He's a disciple. If Rebbe did not, who organized the Mishnah, did not present this Mishnah as a stam Mishnah without any name, it meant that he didn't want to come to any definite decision. He left it as a machlokas without a hakra. So Rabbi Chia, who's only a Talmud, minaylo, how can he decide how to paskin and be machriya against a Mishnah? Amalei. So Rav Nachman turns to Rabbi Avo, and he says the following: are you telling me that if you have a stam Mishnah and a machlokas and a brisa, you paskin like the stam Mishnah? Vatnan, we have a Mishnah that will indicate that we paskin against the stam Mishnah, and that's a Mishnah in Masechet Kelim. So this is going to be an example of a stam Mishnah which we don't paskin like. And apparently the reason we don't paskin like that stam Mishnah is because of a brisa. So you see that a brisa is important. Now here at this point we're learning Taros, specifically Kalim, and we're going to talk about a comb that's made of metal, and some of the teeth of the comb have fallen off. And the question is whether the a kli that had contaminated and received tuma, it no longer is a kli, it's not functional anymore, and therefore parchale tuma flies away. Masrek shel pishtan, and now we're talking about a masrek, a comb that's used on raw natural flax, and they would comb the flax and remove different kinds of psolas, of refuse. Shenitlu shinov, and the teeth of this comb have been removed. Nishtayru bo shtayim. However, it still has two teeth, and he can still use those two teeth to function, albeit in a very particular or fragmented way, but nevertheless, the kli remains functional because it's left with two shinayim, tmeos. And therefore, the masrek is a kli. A kli is makabel tuma, unless if all the teeth were removed, the achas, he only has one tooth left, can't function. You could fix it, but then you're making up a new kli. Tahora. There's no tuma in this kli because it's not a kli. A kli is makabel tuma. So this is what's called hafkoa or bittul shem kli. V'kulon shenitlu achas b'fnei atzman tmeos. What about the teeth themselves? If you remove the teeth, and the teeth can serve, let's say, as a sewing needle, if he removes one at a time, he's indicating that he wants to deliberately take each tooth and use it, and it has a function. Tmeos. In such a case, he can use it. He gives an example of a pin. Let's say, for example, you have a cloth, and you want to separate the cloth and stretch it out. So you put one pin in here, another pin in there. Or they used to have candles that were made out of wax, and they used to use a pin to clean out some of the wax that got stuck in the middle of this nair. So in such a case, each one of the teeth has a function. It could be used by tailors or perhaps tanners who work in hides. Now, until now, we've been speaking about a masrek shel pishtan. Now we're switching over to what's called a masrek shel tsemer, which means it's not used to comb flax or natural linen, but rather to comb wool. And again, remove those black, sticky parts of the wool. Shel tsemer shenitlu shinov achas meintayim tahor. Now, what does this mean? Nitlu shinov achas mi beintayim. You have a row of 3 teeth, and the middle tooth of those 3 got removed. In such a case, there's such a space. It's like a tooth. If you're missing a tooth, you'll see it amongst youngsters, hopefully, not amongst older people, but there's such a space in between the 2 teeth that it's not functional anymore. Tahor. Nishtayru bo sholosh b'mokom echad. But if there are 3 contiguous teeth, that's enough, even in the case of tzemer, which needs apparently a more aggressive combing, to function as a masrek. It still has a shem kli. Tome. Paisach hitzona achas mehen. If one of the 3 teeth that was left, we said there were 3 teeth left, is the chitzona, either on this side extreme outside or on the other side, extreme outside. Now, it seems that the teeth on the outside were thicker, wider. And if you removed one, even though it's only one, it creates a larger space and makes it again non-functional. Tahor. Nitlu shtayim. If, let's say, he removes two of the teeth, v'ason lemilkate, he made it into thongs, right, where you can pick something up. You'll even see it today. You know, those small, like almost pinching things. Tmeos. Now, I'm not sure why these are tmeos. You could say they're not functional, but it seems like they are functional. But it could be that if you change the function of a kli, you have to have that in mind. Achas, let's say he took one single shein, viskina lener, and he designated it to clean up and pick out the wax in a ner, o lemituach, or as we said before, to stretch out a piece of cloth, tmeya. So that's the end of the Mishnah. V'kaimalon, Dien halacha kosa Mishnah. We don't paskin like the Stam Mishnah in this case. That's what Rabbi Nachum is asking his Rebbe, Rabbi Avo. So why is it that we don't apply this universal rule of halacha kistam Mishnah? There's no machlokas recorded in this Mishnah, no dissenting view. It's an anonymous Mishnah. Why don't we paskin like this Mishnah? Amalei, so Rabbi Avo says, Bar minei dahi, don't ask me any questions from that Mishnah. Kevon, because the Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish Yami Chavayu, Zo Eino Mishnah. They had a pressing reason to reject that Mishnah. Now, the language of Zo Eino Mishnah sounds very similar to what we have in Braisos very often. We say Mishabeshta. It's like a mistaken Braiso. My time, huh? Amar Rav Huna bar Manoach, Mishmeid Rav Idi, Breid Rav Ika, Mishum de Kasha Rachel Sefer. Why do I assume that this Mishnah is unreliable? Again, very rare that a Mishnah itself, especially a Stam Mishnah, is unreliable, because if we're very careful about reading this Mishnah, we'll see a contradiction between the Reisha and the Sefer in terms of a Masrek Shel Pishton and a Masrek Shel Tzemen. The Katani, it says in the Reisha of this Mishnah, oh, so what we call the Reisha is not what he calls the Reisha. We call the Reisha the Masrek Shel Pishtan. He's cutting up the Mishnah right down the middle, and the Reisha of the second half of the Mishnah is the Masrek Shel Tzemen. Shenitlu Shenov Achas Mi Bein Tayim Tar. So you had three consecutive teeth, and you remove the middle tooth. It's tar. It's not royal attachment. It doesn't have any function. If instead of removing the middle of these three teeth, he removed one tooth on this side or on the other side, but he's still left with two contiguous teeth, is tameh. The implication is that would be tameh. It's only because he removed the middle tooth. It's no longer functional because of the empty space in between. And then the Mishnah says at the very end, Nishtayr bo shalosh Tomit, that you need all three to be left in order for it to remain and retain its same kli. So what's going on here? From the Resha, it implies that two are enough, as long as they're not missing the middle part. And therefore you have two contiguous teeth. But now he's saying in the Mishnah that you require a minimum of 3 teeth in order to retain the same kli and the status of tumah. Sholosh in, shtayim lo. So from the fact that there's a stira in the Mishnah internally, we draw the conclusion that this is not called a Mishnah. It's not reliable. There's something wrong with the transmission of this Mishnah. Hence, we don't paskin like this Mishnah. In general, the universal principle is halachic kistam Mishnah. Umay kusha. Why do you assume that there's a stira between the Reish and the Sefer? Dilma, perhaps we can differentiate between the Reish and the Sefer. And for this, we have to know a little bit more about the structure of this comb that's used to comb wool. It actually has 2 rows of teeth. It has an outer row and an inner row. And the malacha of combing wool is achieved through the outer row, which is called the shura chitzonis. What happens is that they set up a second row of teeth, which is the pnimis, which is inside, not for the purpose of combing, but when the wool sometimes gets loose, it shouldn't fall on the floor. It's caught in, so to speak, a net. The net is that second row, the pnimis of shinayin. In the case of the Resha, that one single tooth was removed from the middle of the 2 extremes, and it's tar, that's referring to B'gav Yasa. That's the middle, or shall we call it the inner row of Shinaim, which is meant to catch. If there's such a wide hole, the tzemer is going to fall through that hole. It's not going to serve as a net to catch it. And the Sefer, that implies that nishtayr bo shtayim tame, all you need is two teeth. That's bibir yasa. That's on the outer row, which is the ikar meleches sorek srika. And with regard to that outer row, we said nishtayru bo shalosh. You need 3 that are left in order to do a srika. If you only have 2 left, even if they're contiguous one to the other, you're not going to be able to achieve a srika, and it's not royal malacha, and therefore it's not makabel tumah because it doesn't have a shame plea. So we're going to put this Mishnah in Taris on the back burners. It's not a pure Mishnah, even though it comes from Taris. Although we could possibly find a reconciliation between the Reish and the Sefer, and if there's no inner contradiction in the Mishnah, then why did Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish agree, ain't no Mishnah, that we reject this Mishnah? So now the Gemara is going to go back to the drawing board, analyze this Mishnah one more time, and try to justify the conclusion of Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish why this Mishnah is not reliable. El mi'acha dekatani v'kulam shenitlu achas b'fnei atzmon tmeos And if he removes one shein at a time, and it's royal attachments to clean up the nair or to stretch out the cloth, tmeos, afal gavdalo his kina. That wasn't his initial intention when he designated this masrek. It was for the purpose of combing, not for the other purposes that we mentioned. And the Mishnah seems to assume that automatically, as soon as it removes each one of these teeth, they are a kli, they're royal attachments, they're makabel tuma, even though lo iskina, he didn't designate it for that purpose. All we care about is objectively, could you or I, Harry or Larry, use the shein? We don't care about this person. His das and his yichud to designate the kli is irrelevant. Amos seifa. How does that size up to the seifa, which says that if one shein achas viskina lener o lemituach tmeya iskino in lo iskino lo. The only reason why a single tooth of a comb that was removed is makabel tuma is because of iskino yichdo. He designated for that purpose. I don't understand what bothered Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish that they rejected this Mishnah based on this question. Dilma, habekatayu v'habelo katayu. There are two different types of combs. One is a comb that has a handle. That's called a katayu. Now, what happens is when he removes a shein, does it have some sort of objective indication that it'll function separately, independently, outside of the framework of the comb? It all depends if it's left with a handle. So in the Reisha, where we don't need hatkana, and it's still makabel tum and has a shem pli, that's a case of mikatayu. When he pulled out the shein, he pulled it out with a little extra piece of wood that would serve, again, it's a very small piece, but it'll serve as a handle. So then he could use it to put the pin in the cloth or to pick out the wax from the candle.
Right.
So therefore, it's objectively, by the nature of the structure of the kli, a kli. But when we said in the sefer that it all depends on hatkana or not, that's below k'tayu. And if it doesn't have that little extra piece of wood to hold on to the shein as a handle, then in and of itself, objectively, it's not royal attachment. He can decide to designate it as such, and he wants to use it by holding on to the pin without its handle, that's fine. That would generate a shem kli and it's makabel tumah. But objectively, without his hatkana, without his yichud, without designated such, it doesn't look like anyone would consider that functional, royal attachment. Now the Gemara is going to offer a different, alternative reconciliation of the Reish and the Sefer. In the name of Rav Papa. Rav Papa, my kuchya, ha biktinasa, ha bi'limasa. In the Sefer, where we require hadkana, that's a case of a shein kitinasa, very small. He doesn't have a base yad. There's no handle that he pulled with it. it's too small to function. It's not makabel tumah. But on the ratio that we said that even if he didn't designate it as such, it's makabel tumah. It's b'shein ali masa, a very thick tooth, and he could use it even without a base yad, and therefore it's objectively functional. And even if he didn't designate it by adding a piece or pulling it out with an extra piece of a handle, nevertheless, because it's so thick, it's functional as is without a handle. It's very hard to hold on to something that's very, very thin. But if it's thick, it's a lot easier to hold on to it, even without a handle. So now we come back to our original question. Why don't we paskin like this Mishnah? Both Abai and Rav Papa have done a brilliant, valiant job in defending the integrity of this Mishnah and interpreting the Mishnah in such a way that there's no conflict between the Reish and Seifa. Why then do we reject this Mishnah? It's a Stam Mishnah, is it not? Mara says it's not a Stam Mishnah. You made a big boo-boo. Mishum de Mesaimima, at the end of the Mishnah, Davkani means if you read it carefully, you didn't read it carefully, but Davka, is Zo Divrei Rabbi Shimon. It's a minority view. It's a dissenting view of Rabbi Shimon. The Chachamim never accepted it. And therefore, we don't paskin like this Mishnah because it's not a Stam Mishnah. Somewhat anticlimactic. He says that in the footnote that there's a Tosefta in Kalim which explains the machlokas between Rabbi Shimon and the Chachamim. Rabbi Shimon says that Tome miyad neshu kosev bal fi Chachamim tome al kenes kina. Time shel Chacham shem sovrim shetzarach sheyaseh me'ein malacha v'lo moel masha osim malacha acheres. So Rabbi Shimon in this whole Mishnah expresses his view, and what underlies the entire Mishnah is the principle of Rabbi Shimon, that you can have a brand new function. And that gives it a shem kli. The Rabbanan say we need me'ein malachta, a new function that has nothing in common with the original designation and function, is not able to maintain the same kli. The Chacham would agree to Reb Shimon if lechatchila he created it for that purpose, as a pin, to stretch the cloth, etc., that would be makabel tumah. But when you destroy a kli and you want to say that from the breakage of the kli, I now have another function, the Chacham say unless it's me'ein malachto harichona, doesn't have a shem kli. And personally, I would add the following comment. This is a big issue in Masechet Shabbos about muktzah. And the laws of muktzah are very similar and interdependent with the laws of tum v'tara as far as shem kli is concerned. A kli is not muktzah on Shabbos. But what happens if there's shivrei kelim and the Tanoim are going to argue whether you need me'ein malachta rishona in order to maintain the shem kli? And here we see it as a machlokas Reb Shimon Chacham in tum v'tara as to whether the kli is makabel tum. Sholach Reb Chia bar Ovin. Now, we had a long discussion, you may remember last week, about a woman who was divorced or widowed, and she wants to get remarried. She has to wait a minimum of 3 months.
Right.
However, the whole purpose of waiting, lahavkin bein zera zera, should only apply in a full-fledged marriage, meaning if the second husband brought her into the chuppah and there'll be intimacy. But if it's only erisin, that's a whole different story. Ma'arsin tov shlosha. You don't have to wait 3 months for Erison. V'chein osim maisa. This is not just a theoretical halachic ruling, but in actuality, that's what we saw. The Chachamim implemented that principle. Now we have another message that was sent by Rabbi Chia. V'chein hoya Rabbi Elazar melamdenu mishum Rabbi Chanina Gadol rubo shel rishon v'rubo shel shlishi emtzoi shalom. And in the past, we've discussed this Gemara. It's a pella of a Gemara. The Gemara is saying it doesn't mean 3 full months of 90 days. It means halachic months. Here we're dealing with a biological question. Is she pregnant? Is she not pregnant? Is she showing? Is she not showing? And yet the Gemara says the 3-month period is defined by halachic months. So if you have Rov and Rov with an emtza, that's sholem, so you've got, let's say, 16, 16, and 30, which is the equivalent to 62. I don't know if that's the magic number here. 62 days, and let's marry her off. Where the 90 days? We basically cut out 28 days out of the 90. Now we have a different machlokas. What happens if we waited 3 months? What's the status of the last day of the 3 months? Day number 90. Amemar shari lioris biyom tishim. Amemar was lenient on the last day, and basically he's applying the principle of miktsas hayom kikulo. Excuse me, which again indicates that we're not dealing with pure biology over here. We're dealing with legal definitions. Amalei Rav Ashi Lamemar. How could you be matir on the 90th day for Rav Ushmuel Dami Chavayu Tzricha lahamtin shlosha chadashim chutz miyom shemeisbo v'chutz miyom shenisarstavo. Basically, it's 92 days. It's not 90 days. The day on which she was widowed, and now the day on which she is getting remarried, those 2 days are not counted. They have to be sandwiched by a full 90 days in between. So obviously you can't count day 90 when you need 92 days.
Yeah.
What? Is that me or you?
No, background, don't worry. It's fine.
Oh, okay. So now the Gemara gives Amemar an opportunity to defend himself. And he says, Hahu meinekes itmar. When the transmission of Rav and Shmuel that excluded the 2 days of Misa at the beginning and Erison at the end, that was not referring to a case of an almana or a grusha, and we need havchan of 3 months. No. It was in a totally different context. And it has to do with the 24-month waiting period with regard to either a pregnant woman or a nursing woman. Itmar. Meinekes itmar derab l'shvuli am chavayu. Tzricha lahamtin 24 chodesh chutz miyom shenolad bo v'chutz miyom shenisarsa bo. So we're going to need 12 full months plus the day before the 12th. That's the day of Leda, and another day after the 12 months to marry her off on that day. But with regard to waiting 3 months, in order to differentiate between Zera Shal Rishon and Zera Shal Hasheni, there we could be makil and allow for Erison on day number 90 at the end of the 3 months. And Rav Meimar does not offer any, at least apparent, any obvious distinction or logical reason why we would make such a distinction. One is tempted to think that 12 months is an inyan of sakana. The baby will be endangered because, again, nursing in those times was chiyuni, as we say here in Israel. It was absolutely vital. So we can't start playing games with halachic days and so forth and so on. We have to make sure the baby gets a full 24 months of nursing. The case of Avchana, as we've already seen, there's a lot of flexibility and leniency because what are really the chances that she's pregnant and she's not showing, and now we get to day 90, she's still not showing? So the Gemara raises the following objection: Va'ahudi avad seudas ersim yom tishim v'afsedei rava l'sudasa. There was an individual, probably in the city of Machos of Rava, who made a seuda, great festive celebration, a banquet on the day of the Erison when it was the 90th day. And Rava said, throw it all out. They didn't have refrigeration like we have. Rava was attacking. So the Gemara says, Hahi sudas nesuin havoy. We're allowing, says Amemar, Erison on the 90th day, but not nesuin. Nesuin, which is already intimacy, we have to wait until after the 90 days. So that calms us down a little bit about our problem that we raised before. Why are you counting the 90th day as a halachic legal counting, mixas hayom, etc., when we're dealing with a biological question? But the answer is they were only matir erison on day 90, not nesuin. So there was no intimacy. Chutz miyom shenoled bo, v'chutz miyom shenisasra bo. But with regard to a woman who's not a meinekes and her husband died or divorced, tzricha lahamtin shlosha chadashim, and once again we're going to be machmir chutz miyom shemeis bo, chutz miyom shenisasra bo. We need 90 days sandwiched in between the day of the death of a husband and the day of the remarriage. And the Rambam, when he codifies this halacha in Perek Yud Aleph Milchas Gerushin, velotis ares ashetamtin tisha yom chutz v'yom shenisgarsha o shemeisa balabo v'chutz v'yom shenisarsa. So the Rambam is not going to count the 90th day to allow for erison, even erison. Now we go back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah records the sheet of Rabbi Yossi, who would allow a woman erison without amton of 3 months because there's no intimacy. However, Rabbi Yossi had a different problem, and that is the 30 days of avelus that's incumbent upon a woman when she loses her husband. And the issue here at stake is, do we consider erison as a maisa simcha that's antithetical to avelus? It undermines avelus. It would seem that Rabbi Yossi holds that during that 30 days of avelus, even erison is prohibited, because that would undermine avelus. Did they have a sudas erison? It seems to be irrelevant. Omer Rav Chizda, I don't get it. With regard to Tisha B'Av, which is also a mitzvah of avelus, we allow Erison on Tisha B'Av itself. Erison is not antithetical to Avelus. It's not a Maisa Simcha. Kal v'chomer. Now, again, we're talking here about what's called Shavua Shechal Bo Tisha B'Av. Ma b'makom she'asu lechabes, the basic fundamental Isur of Avelus that applies during Shavua Shechal Bo Tisha B'Av is Kibus. But Mutul Le'ares, we're going to allow Erison, presumably without a Suda. We're not going to make a Suda on Tisha B'Av. Is Makom Shemutal Lechabes, in the case of an Avel during 30 days, he's allowed to wash his clothes, right? The Isur Rechitza is during 7. Is Eino Din Shemutal Yaris. How much more so with the Kal V'chomer, which would be Matir Erison? A brilliant, logical analysis of Rav Chizda. Where's the source for this halacha that even though there's an Isur Kibus during Shavua Shechal Bo, nevertheless Erison is mutter? The Tanan we learned in the Mishnah at the end of Tainis. Shabbos means a week. Shechal Tisha B'Av b'socha. Also l'saper ulekabes. No haircuts and no laundering, with one exception. Bechamishi mutter mipnei kavod Shabbos. So I'm not sure if in our calendar this could work out. That Tisha B'Av is on a Friday. I don't know. Right. I'm not sure. Do you remember?
A Tisha B'Av
on a Friday.
Friday.
I don't think we have it. But back in the time of the Gemara, they had it. And they would allow taking a haircut and laundering clothes, l'kavod Shabbos, on Thursday, which was the 8th of Av. Vitanya, kodem hazman hazeh, before Tisha B'Av, and we're getting close to Tisha B'Av, ha'omer matim v'skeyem, they diminish their monetary transactions, buying and selling lisa v'litein, mi livnos. Okay, this has to do with something called binyan shel simcha. If you build a chuppah for a wedding, that's called a binyan shel simcha. V'lin toa, they used to have special trees and foliage for the kings. That's called a netiyah shel simcha. I think we had it in Masechet Eruvin, if I remember correctly. He doesn't mention it. But it was a tree that the foliage was very thick and it would bend over, and it created a tremendous shade, a beautiful area for the kings, to like a gazebo, where they would go out and enjoy the air.
Right.
Uma arsin. This is where we want to put the underlaw. And you're allowed to have erison in Shavua Shechal Bo, even though we said kibus is awesome. Avalo konsin. We're not going to allow nesuin. We're only going to allow erison. Nesuin is simcha, but erison is just a ma'aser kinyan. It's not a ma'aser simcha. Is therefore v'yeina osim sudas erison. Erison, although it's not in and of itself inherently a ma'aser simcha, you could upgrade it to a ma'aser simcha by making a suda. I don't know about shidduchim. Could be shidduchim is not a simcha, even if you add a sa'ud. But as far as erison is concerned, erison could expand and be upgraded to a ma'aser simcha through what? Through the mechanism of sa'uda. Okay. The last time I saw Sudas Erison on On Zoom, I was screaming out and you couldn't hear me. But it wasn't Zoom. It was something else. What they called Streamline or something.
Another system.
And Ira, you were so close to me.
Right.
I could see every move, but you couldn't hear me say Mazel Tov.
Right.
So we now have a problem. If the Mishnah says that before Tisha B'Av, when it's also to do kibbutz, Erusin is mutter, then how much more so if Erusin is mutter during Shavuot Shechalvo, it's not a Maisa Simcha, it's not antithetical to Avelus, why would Rav Yossi prohibit a woman whose husband died to have an Erusin? So the Gemara answers, Ki Tanya Ahi, Kodem de Kodem. We made a mistake and we thought that when the Mishnah allowed Erusin in Masechet Tainis, it was referring to Shavuot Shechalbo. No, in Shavuot Shechalbo, both kibbutz and Erusin is prohibited. But Kodem de Kodem, what we call the 9 days, which is from Rosh Chodesh Av, then Erusin is mutter. But when we get to the more intense level of Avelus,
Right.
which is called Shavuot Shechalbo, then Erusin is also. Omar Rava, the Kodem Nami. He says, even if I grant you that the Brisa was addressing the case of Rosh Chodesh Av, which means the 9 days, I would still say that there is a logical kal v'chomer. Why? Uma b'makom she'asur lisa v'litain. From the beginning of the 9 days, Rosh Chodesh Av, we prohibit these kind of business interactions. And yet, mutaliares, but we allow Erusin. Now let's look at Shloshim Yimei Avelus, a woman who lost her husband. Makom shemuta lisa v'lite. We don't find during Shloshim that there's an Isser of lisa v'lite. That's only appropriate during Shiva. Yisayno din shemuta liares. Says Rava, even if I grant you that it's Kodem L'Kodem, but the fact that Kodem L'Kodem is muta liares, I still have a kal v'chomer to Avelus of Shloshim, because in Kodem de Kodem we have an Isser of Masa Umata, which we don't have in Shloshim. So the Gemara answers, Lo Tema, you made a mistake in the Girsa of the Mishnah. Our Girsa says to Rabbi Yossi Omer Kol HaNoshim Yisarsu, that in all cases we're going to allow Erusin, with the exception of an Almana, Mishuma Ibul. No. That's a mistake. Even Rabbi Yossi would allow Erusin during Shloshim Yimei Avelus. Ela Ema, you should read the Mishnah in the following way. Kol HaNoshim Yinasu, not Yisarsu. Yinasu. Chutz min Almana, and an Almana is not permitted to have Nisuin during 30 days because of Avelus. But Erusin is mutter, because Nisuin is inherently, by definition, a Maisa Simcha. And the Gemara is now saying that Kol HaNoshim Yinasu Chutz mi Almana, and Rabbi Yossi is doing away with the entire enterprise of Havchana. He's going to allow Nisuin without delaying. He's not waiting 3 months. That's a pretty radical chiddush. And that's what the Gemara is going to take up here on Daf Mem Gimel Amid Beis. Okay, but here I'm going to take a break and wish you a great week and a Chag Sameach. So I think we'll probably get together after Pesach.
Yeah.
All right, thanks. All the best.